evening and welcome, dear friends, to this fifth session of the 2023 Turner Winter Series, now in its 18th year and now coming to you from the Kappa Theater in the Robert H. Jackson Center here in Jamestown. I'm Maureen Raveno. Whether you are here in person, watching through live streaming, or if you are joining us later via YouTube, it is my great pleasure to begin our time together with a brief introduction of our very distinguished guest, Stephen Abdella, which will then initiate the conversation between Steve and our perennial host and the founder of this series, Jamestown's and the Jackson Center's own Greg Peterson. So let me first say a few words to get to know and appreciate Steve Abdella. Stephen Abdella is the recently retired Chautauqua County attorney after a 32-year career in county government. He is currently of counsel to the Jamestown law firm of Lundberg Price, P.C. Born in Jamestown in 1959, he graduated from Jamestown High School in 1977, serving as treasurer of his class throughout high school. In his senior year, he was selected for the New York State Conference All-State Concert Band for baritone saxophone. He received his undergraduate and law degrees from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Upon returning to Jamestown from law school in 1985, Steve joined his father, James Abdella, to form the law firm of Abdella and Abdella. He served as legal counsel to New York State Senator just present from 86 to 88, and then as assistant county attorney from 88 to 91. Appointed by County Executive Andrew Goodell as county attorney from 92 to 97, he thereafter served as counsel to the county legislature from 99 to 2005. Reappointed as county attorney in 2006 by County Executive Greg Edwards upon his retirement at the end of 2022, Steve had served as either a county attorney or counsel to the county legislature during the administrations of 7 of the 8 Chautauqua County executives in the history of the county. On 2 occasions, he was acting county executive when county executives Greg Edwards and George Borrello left office prior to the expiration of their terms. Steve also served as general counsel for Jamestown Community College from 2002 to 2019. Steve was treasurer of the County Attorneys Association of the State of New York from 2014 to 2022 and president from 1997 to 1996 through 1997. Over the years, he served as president of the Jamestown Bar Association, secretary of the Jamestown Chamber of Commerce, president of the Estate Planning Council of Jamestown, and president of the 100-member club of Jamestown High School alumni. He has also been a member of the Chautauqua County Charter Commission, Chautauqua County Environmental Management Council, and the board of directors of the Reg Lene Civic Center. Steve enjoys running, cycling, and cross-country skiing and has completed 19 cross-country ski marathons in Canada, New Hampshire, New York, and Wisconsin. An avid hiker, he is an Adirondack 46er, having completed ascents of all of the 46 peaks over 4,000 feet in the Adirondack Mountains of New York State. He has completed the difficult Alta Via 2 hiking trail in the Dolomites of the Italian Alps. He and his extended family have continuously held season tickets to University of Michigan football games since the early 1960s and Buffalo Bills season tickets since the formerly named Rich Stadium opened in 1973. Steve and his wife Ann live in the town of Kyantone, and they have celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 2022. As you can see, there is much history to discuss, so let's please relax and enjoy as we welcome our perennial host, Greg Peterson, in a fun and fascinating conversation with our distinguished guest, Stephen Abdella.
I have been trying to get you in front of a camera for years, and we finally have arrived. And I was so pleased to know that you're the guy I can talk to because we're the president of the 100-member club of Jamestown High School alumni. Apparently, I was the 101st because I just couldn't get in. I just wondered how the door was. So, fun and fascinating, that's what we got to talk about here tonight. And were you destined to be a lawyer?
Perhaps. It ran in the family. My father and two aunts were lawyers, and then an uncle as well. But I'll admit that it was really just almost a default move for me, because I came out of undergrad school not sure what I wanted to do. I thought, well, a law degree can be used for lots of things, so I just continued going. But eventually, I mean, it was the right decision because you had the opportunity to do any number of things, which played out here in Jamestown for me.
Talk about your mom and dad, because I'm sure your mother at some point will see this.
Well, my mom and dad did not grow up in the Jamestown area, but they did grow up in upstate New York. My father was born and grew up in Gloversville, New York, about 30 miles west of Albany. And then my mom grew up in Delmar, New York, which is a suburb of Albany.
Yeah.
But they didn't meet until they went to college in Virginia at William and Mary, where I went, even though they grew up just 30 miles apart. But then they returned to upstate and landed in Jamestown.
So your dad was part of a lawyer family. Why Jamestown?
Well, he actually wanted to go back and practice with his uncle in Gloversville, but the timing just wasn't right when he graduated to go into that small firm. So his uncle said, well, if you just give it 5 years, why don't you come back then perhaps? So my father was just familiar with actually the upstate small cities, mostly from, I think it was the Pony League that existed at that time.
Right.
And he went to the University of Michigan Law School, saw an ad on a bulletin board for a law firm in Jamestown, the former Johnson, Peterson, Tiener, and Anderson, that had several U of M grads, and he traveled to Jamestown and knocked on the door, literally. They had already filled that position, but they decided to hire him nonetheless when he made that application.
Because he brought in the big Michigan blue sign and said,
I think that helped a little bit.
Yeah, I could see it. And so your dad coming here, was there an acclamation of figuring out what Chautauqua County's like? This is, for him, probably small town America.
Well, in that respect, probably not too different from Gloversville, which was actually a little bit smaller than Jamestown. So I think a lot in common with all of the small upstate cities. Manufacturing was their root, and so I don't think it was probably that big a culture shock to locate here.
So your dad was with the law firm of Johnson, Peterson, Tiener, and Anderson, and he gravitated towards tax. Was that natural?
I don't think so, though. He did have a strong accounting and business background, but that's what the law firm needed at that point. And so you answer that call, that was the need. So that's how he ended up in the tax area primarily.
And then, but he also, politics grabbed him at some point. Can you recall how that all happened?
Was not anything he was planning on, but in 1980, the Republican Party was looking for a candidate to run against Stan Lundeen, the incumbent congressman who was the former mayor of Jamestown, who my dad knew very well. They were both lawyers and attorneys in this community for years. And it was that point in time in life where he was feeling a little bit restless and decided to jump into it really as a novice politician. And that it was an exciting time. I mean, he didn't win, but it was good timing as far as it being 1980 and Ronald Reagan running for office. And so it was a good spirited campaign.
So when he comes home, I'm just imagining the dining room table when he comes in and tells your mom, I'm thinking about running. What was the conversation like?
Well, I was off in college at that point, so I don't know, but she embraced it pretty much as well. And I mentioned I had two aunts who were lawyers out in Michigan. They actually came out and worked on the campaign also. Took time off from their job. So it was a family event.
Did you come back and work on it?
I did to some degree, but it was my senior year in college, and I didn't really want to give that up. So I did some work, but not as much as my two siblings did.
And that's your sibling? Why don't you talk about them?
Well, my sister Cindy, who's the eldest of us, she's spent her career in Washington, D.C. She's the president of what's called the Congressional Women's Policy Institute, which is a bipartisan organization that took the place of the Congressional Women's Caucus. And so it is an organization that follows all women's issues and monitors all legislation in Congress regarding women's issues. My brother is an attorney with a large law firm, Harder, Seacrest, and Emery, up in Rochester, and has spent his whole career with that law firm.
So you go to William and Mary. Both your mom and dad went there?
Yes.
And so went to college and then ultimately hung around there for law school. You graduate from law school, then you got to make a decision. Was your dad reeling you in at that point?
Yes, he very much wanted me to come back to Jamestown, and I'm looking at my wife, who's in the audience here, who is a native Richmonder from Virginia, and so she was willing to come along up north to be with the Yankees. I was a carpetbagger. All those names came out, but yeah, she came up and ended up in her own right doing very well here.
She had, but I lived a similar situation where there was probably a deep breath when you have a Richmond, Virginia person saying, "You're going where, when?" Obviously, it turned out fine as well. So you come up here in 1988? Let's see, when did you come back here?
85.
85, wow. But you also did some work with Just Present. And what was that about?
Well, I think he actually approached me, but we were co-located. Our office, private law office, was on the 9th floor of the Hotel Jamestown building, and Senator Present's office was just down the hall. Mm-hmm. And he was interested in having a legal counsel in his local office. He had a counsel up in Albany, and I was located right down the hall. I was young, and he came knocking one day and said, "Would you help me on a part-time basis?" And I kind of knew pretty quickly after I started the private practice of law that I wanted to do more than just be a general practitioner in Jamestown. I wanted to test the waters with other things as well, and that was the first opportunity to do it, and I took it.
Just to get you with Abdella, your dad was with Johnson, Peterson, Tiener, and Anderson, Joe Pita for shortness, and then he left with a Buffalo law firm for a period of time, right?
That's right. For just a few years, he left Johnson Peterson and was with Saperson and Day, the Buffalo law firm, and did well there, but what I think he soon learned was he was pretty independent in the way he wanted to practice law, and that didn't fit perhaps so well in the big firm environment. So he did establish his own office. He perhaps had an inkling at that point that I might come back, but I don't think he made the decision based on me coming back to town. He just decided to open his own office.
Oh, those big Buffalo law firms, I'm telling you. So, but as now you're with Abdella, what'd your dad have you do? General?
General practice, really, and it was probably, he was still doing a fair amount of tax work at that point, but the usual real estate, corporate, some minor criminal law work, some of it as assigned counsel, just a little bit of everything typical of a Jamestown lawyer.
Did you get dragged in at all to be assigned counsel for family court or county court or any of those things?
Just the criminal courts. Somehow I avoided family court. I'm not sure why. but just the criminal courts.
So give me a story in criminal court, because we all have them as young and not knowing what we're doing. And you might have a Lee Town Adams story that you could share.
Well, actually, the one that comes to mind that wasn't so much it was not an assigned counsel case, but was a DWI case involving a defendant who was from Corey, Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not proceeding towards settlement. I mean, normally those were kind of cut and dry cases, and I had not tried any sort of DWI case or any criminal case, so to speak. And what ended up happening was the defendant passed away literally a few weeks before it might have gone to trial. And so I was off the hook, and one of the things you just wouldn't have expected.
So you obviously defended him very well. There was no conviction.
That's right, and part of what made it interesting was that the deputy who had pulled him over was someone who was a strong family acquaintance, and that was going to make it perhaps a little bit awkward too, but all of that got avoided.
Did you go to court much?
Not so much. It was actually mostly as the county attorney that I did, and that was occasional, but we would get served with the occasional Article 78 proceeding, which is when the actions of a public official are challenged as to their legality. And so those would come sporadically, and they were a little bit nerve-wracking because the media likes and loves it. Well, I shouldn't say loves, but they find it good for selling newspapers, perhaps, or otherwise, when the county gets sued. And so these cases would get a lot of media attention when they happened. And sometimes they had political aspects to them, too.
No. So you, you're a private attorney, and yet you found that there was opportunities perhaps elsewhere. Tell me about when Andy reached out to you to see if you wanted to be part of his office.
Well, it was actually Bob Laughlin.
Oh, excuse me, that's correct, yeah.
Who was the county attorney before Andrew was county attorney,
Okay.
who asked me to come to the county attorney's office. Within a year or so, Bob moved on to become the personnel director of the county. And Andrew, who was the first assistant at that time, became county attorney.
Gotcha.
So it was Bob Laughlin who offered me a position in the county attorney's office.
Now, most people watching this tape will be lawyers, and Bob Laughlin is a name, but he passed away some time ago. So talk a little bit about him.
Well, Bob was, the classic, old crusty attorney from the days who we talk about doing general practice. From his generation, they did everything. I mean, they tried cases, they wrote wills, they did corporate work, they did everything. And Bob was from Westfield, but also, as many lawyers back in the day, was politically involved as well, and became Jack Glenzer's county attorney when Jack was elected county executive. So Bob was, to use the vernacular, a piece of work. I mean, he was entertaining, came off as very gruff in some respects, but like many of those types of individuals, had a soft place in his heart and would do anything for someone who was in need. So that was a side that people didn't always see. I know that things were different back then in terms of the politics. The legislature for many years, county legislature, was very equally split. And Bob came in as county attorney, and you serve as the parliamentarian to the legislature. Well, Bob didn't necessarily have the greatest respect for some of the political dialogue that took place. So I remember coming to a county legislature meeting, and I had no idea how they operated or how it worked. And Bob is sitting not up like we did now, which was right next to the chairman of the legislature. He sat at a table to the side. And he always read the Wall Street Journal during these meetings. And you'd see him up there. Now, of course, the legislators didn't necessarily view that as respectful, but it was Bob's way of saying he thought a lot of their debate really just wasn't that, relevant or germane to the issue of the day. And so that was, to me, pretty humorous to see him up there reading the journal.
So Bob was part of Brandt and Laughlin at the time for old timers, and then that became part of Bart Shack's world and Jack Whipple's and all of that. So Bob is who brought you in?
Yes.
To public service. So did they say anything special to you to entice you?
Well, at the time, I spoke about being a little bit restless and wanting to do more than just general practice, and it was a part-time position in the county attorney's office. So I had been looking, and I actually had a few other possibilities. One was to become an assistant public defender. Mm-hmm. The other was and this would have been way different from everything else. We spoke about the tax background of my father, and I was doing some estate planning and work like that. Chautauqua Institution had a new position called Director of Planned Giving. And I put in an application for that too. They were contemplating a full-time position. I pitched it to them as a part-time position. And so I really had those three opportunities kind of swirling at the same time. And Bob ended up being the first to push me to say, I need a decision, I really want someone in the office. And I was torn on what were really three different career opportunities, but I'd always had the interest in government and had that bug really in the family, and so I chose the county attorney's office.
So within the county attorney's office, there are many, certainly now, many areas of interest, but was yours did Bob have you do general stuff? Any specific part of the county attorney's office he had you do?
Well, initially, he said, why I'm hiring a person is the Director of Public Works, as it was called at that time, was George Riedesel, and he was upset with how fast his contracts were processed. And I see some county officials in the audience here who might laugh. That's just forever an issue. And so Bob said, I'm hiring you to be the Department of Public Works attorney, get their contracts done, just do whatever they need. I'm tired of hearing George Riedesel's complaints. So that's what I did, did all the Public Works legal work for the first couple years.
And then Bob, I forget whether he retired or how Andy got involved. But I know he was assistant county attorney, then became county attorney. What happened to Bob?
So Bob became the personnel officer, human resource director for the county, and Andrew came in as county attorney in 1989. This is really just a year after come into the office as assistant county attorney. And just like that, Jack Glenser announces he's not running for re-election, and Andy, age 34, decides to run for county executive. And he does that in '89. I did get involved in Andrew's campaign and supporting him in that regard. And everything just moved really fast, and Andy's elected county executive in 1989, which allowed me to become elevated to first assistant county attorney. Betsy Steger was named county attorney. The first and only female county attorney in our county's history. And she decided to move on to be social services attorney in 1992, and that's when Andrew asked me to become county attorney. And I was 32 years old at that time, and it's just, it was a different world back then. I think you just had more younger people involved in these offices and in these positions. And so I'll say I'm very happy and thrilled that my successor is in his late 30s, Patrick Slagle, because I believe strongly that it's good to have, the younger generations plugged in to the political world and government for the good of the county.
So perfect timing, I'm going to hand to you, because you've now entered the world of the public sector. A year ago, here at the Jackson Center, we gathered all of the county executives, and one by Zoom, one place, one time, to talk about their careers and some of their highlights. And we also highlighted a guy named Steve Abdella, who was interim or acting county executive on a couple of occasions. So I'm going to hand you baseball cards that we did at the time. And if you could just kind of walk down memory lane as you're looking at whether you have any impressions of Joe Girassi, who had predated you politically, but you may have some story, and Glenzer, Goodell, and maybe go down, and because you'll do a better job yourself looking at this and being prompted.
Well, Joe Girassi, was the first county executive in Chautauqua County, and definitely, cut the new paths, and any first person like that is going to chart new territory, and he definitely did that. And the county government at that time was taking over many of the functions of leading up to the charter form of government with a county executive, taking over functions from the cities and the towns and the villages, and that's something that's been a progression to this day. And so Joe, and I'll say this about all the county executives, are that they are incredibly dedicated to the job, and you have to be. It's a 24/7 position, and people don't realize what the pressures are in that job. So every one of these gentlemen were very dedicated in that respect. And I heard the stories about Joe and going away to conferences and things. I mean, before the age of laptop computers, and he'd bring this giant briefcase of work, and while everyone else was maybe out to dinner and staying out late at the bar or whatever, Joe was, as I heard it, was working on county business during the off hours of these conferences. Jack Glenzer, the first person where I was working in the county attorney's office, who was the county executive. I mean, Jack, salt of the earth kind of guy, no nonsense, and yet had respect for everyone regardless of party, and would work with anybody. There's a lot of good stories. I mean, as he's spoken about in some of the interviews, the big issue of his day was the county landfill, and the county was in the process of shifting over to a fee charge system as opposed to simply subsidizing the entire landfill with the county tax base. And meanwhile, the facility needed to be expanded, and he had a lot of difficult times with the DEC and navigated those waters, in part, I think, with the help of Bob Laughlin and Andy Goodell, and so they had a lot of time with that landfill issue. And that's something you find is the issues in county government are somewhat cyclical. And what, say, today's big political issue ends up receding into sort of a humdrum carrying on day to day, and then maybe all of a sudden it comes back at some point. You just never know. Andy, who was the first to appoint me as county attorney, he was a mentor as well, because he had been the county attorney, and he's a brilliant lawyer. And he embraced municipal law. So I was able to, learn a lot from Andrew, including, both the legal and the political aspects. But as is the case with all politicians, I mean, you have You have your strengths, and then you have, I don't know if weakness is the right word, but you have some soft spots where you need somebody to watch your back. And yeah, the county attorney tries to act in that role. But
Let me just stop for 1 second.
Yes.
The role of a county attorney is to represent who and what?
your client is actually the corporation, the municipal corporation of the county. However, as we know, the county is made up of many elected officials, and you're also responsible for representing them. But your ultimate allegiance is to the county, and in that regard, you could say the taxpayers of the county. So that puts the county attorney in an interesting spot on occasions, because you do have to look out and look after the interests of the elected officials and make sure, they're defended properly. But your ultimate client is the county, and so it puts a little bit of pressure on you, and that's part of the challenge and excitement of the job and of being a general counsel for, in this case, a corporate entity that has a myriad of operations. The practice of law in many professions has become heavily specialized. In this job, you become specialized in a way, but you're forced as a general counsel to be able to see the forest through the trees and understand more than just the law. It's critical in this job, and it raises your stress. It makes it a high-pressure job, but I loved it for that reason as well.
Andrew, then the next elected official was Mark Thomas, and at that time, there really never been a separate council for the legislature. So kind of walk me through that dynamic there. There was Mark gets elected, and I think was Fred the county attorney?
Yes, Fred Larson became the county attorney, replacing me after Mark was elected. But just prior to Mark being elected, a charter commission was working, and it was that commission that recommended that the charter be amended to provide for the legislature to have the opportunity to appoint its own council. And what was written into the charter, though, was that appointment had to be the joint mutual appointment of both the chairman of the legislature and the minority leader, something that's rather unusual in government. So it forced there to be a bipartisan choice as counsel to the legislature. And so it was the case that soon after I left as county attorney, the new charter came into place, and the legislature was looking for an attorney to be their counsel on a part-time basis. And I applied for that, knowing that because I was closely associated with a county executive as county attorney, that I might not, be considered for the legislative council position, but did end up getting that position.
Which is a real tip of the hat. I mean, to your selection of that. So then you were legislative counsel, so your client then was the legislature.
In that case, it was the legislature itself. And so that was a bit easier, other than you have a majority party and a minority party. So as the single counsel for that body, you have to represent the legislature as a whole.
Maybe behind the curtain a little bit, but did you have to find yourself as legislative counsel to kind of go over to one caucus and then the other to sort of get the political wins? That's not necessarily going to affect your legal decision, but nevertheless, political will is important.
I did need to meet with the leadership, and there were occasions on the night of sometimes of a legislature meeting, if there was a contentious item of legislation that had legal aspects, I would end up traveling to both caucuses to talk with them about that legislation that was up that night.
So your legislative council, you don't often know what's, it's not scripted. You know what the agenda is. Can you cite an instance or two where there was sort of that surprise factor saying, where did that come from? And then ultimately they look to council. The chairman of the legislature may say, all right, council, what do you think? And you go, holy cow. I thought I had this handled.
Well, a couple instances. I mean, and this was while I was county attorney, but you're serving as parliamentarian and legislative counsel. I spoke to there being issues with the landfill, and it was a problem time where day to day that landfill had to act. And sometimes you get into difficulty because the legislature only meets once or twice a month. It was actually twice a month back at that time. And there was some instance where the landfill staff went ahead and spent money that perhaps had not yet been appropriated. Now, I found that out. I wasn't county attorney yet, but I ended up having to substitute that night for Betsy, thinking to myself, well, of course it's the meeting that I get assigned that something like this happens. And I find out literally minutes before the meeting that it's going to come out at that meeting that the landfill spent money that had not yet been appropriated. And they were seeking to get it rubber stamped that night by legislative resolution. Well, yeah, it's a Republican administration. The Democratic members of the legislature finding this out, went wild. And I was on the hot seat with the questions being asked, how could they spend money that hadn't been appropriated? And really there was no good answer. You had to say they didn't have legal authority, but they're seeking ratification tonight, and they felt they had no choice. They were under regulatory mandates. Had they not gone forward with this expense, the landfill would have been in violation of their permit. So that sort of thing, when you're a young county attorney, not even the county attorney yet, and it's maybe the second or third meeting that you've ever acted as parliamentarian, that gets your blood pressure up.
Yeah.
There was another instance where Andy Goodell vetoed a portion of the budget. And he has line item budget veto authority. The administrative code at that point in time said his vetoes needed to be in by 10 a.m. Andy filed his vetoes at 11 a.m. It really wasn't noticed by anyone. I don't think I even knew. I'm pretty sure I did not know before the night of the legislature. And the minority, or I was the minority at that point, discovered this and asked the question. It's our understanding that the county executive's vetoes weren't in by 10 o'clock. County attorney, are these valid vetoes? Well, I don't know how. I think there ended up being a little bit of a recess because the Republicans were taken aback by this as well and wanted to just figure out how to respond. So I had a moment to look at it and ended up realizing that the charter said vetoes had to be in on the 10th day. It said nothing about the time of day. And the code said 10 a.m. on the 10th day. Somehow came to the conclusion that, well, the charter is superior and has higher dignity than the code, so he's got till midnight. Well, still though, this is the administrative code says 10 a.m., so I stood up there and said, code provisions superseded by the charter, the vetoes are valid, and they take effect. And a lawsuit came out of that. Michael Bobstein, who was the minority leader, I believe, or assistant minority leader at that time, he wasn't a lawyer yet, brought a pro se lawsuit. in Supreme Court challenging Andy's vetoes. And so it got tested in law, and that sort of spur-of-the-moment opinion ended up being tested in court, and we did prevail, and the charter did rule over the code, and Andrew's vetoes were valid. But those were interesting moments as parliamentarian to answer those questions when, as you say, you don't expect them and had no knowledge of them ahead of time.
Just if we're watching, Mark, we're going to get back to you. Mark Thomas, you want to continue on?
So Mark, I enjoyed working with Mark. I mean, there were moments, as we say, back in those times. I mean, the legislature was typically 13 to 12 or 14 to 11, and the politics were very contentious. This was our first go-round having a legislative council while we have a county attorney at the same time. So I had to work, with Fred Larson as county attorney to solve some of these, legal interpretational issues, and it worked out well, I think, and Mark Thomas had a good demeanor for those things, and it worked out.
Then next on the agenda, Greg Edwards.
Enjoyed working with Greg very much. Brought me back to the county attorney role, and he worked on several things and laid the groundwork for items that later county executives were able to take up, including trying to regionalize water in the North County, and also I think starting to explore the potential sale of the county home. But also a big project during Greg's tenure was creating an energy, refuse to energy facility at the county landfill. And that, was unique in that the county made the decision to own that facility as opposed to simply leasing the rights to another entity. So that was new territory, frankly, for all of New York State. And that was a big project. And he was very personable. He was new to county government. He wasn't like some of the others who had some prior elected office, either as a legislator or, in Mark Thomas's case, a town supervisor. So with each new county executive, there's going to be a learning curve, and that's to be expected. And so Greg was great to work with. He was, wanted to tap all the experience that I and others could bring him in that office.
Did you find that, by the way, most county attorneys or county executives in their kind of early weeks kind of said, hey, Steve, tell me what's going on. I mean, can you give me the skinny of what's going on in county government? Did you feel like you're a mentor?
Yes, you do. And but you always have respect for these individuals who have, stuck their necks out to run for this office and clearly are very interested in the county and its future and doing well for it. So the thing that happens, though, is most of them aren't necessarily familiar with all of the rules, for instance, involving civil service and labor relations. And especially if they've come from the private sector, they want to come in and change things and perhaps privatize things and cut through the red tape of government, which is everyone wants to do, but New York is New York State, and there's a lot of rules and laws regarding those things, and so there's a lot to navigate. So you always have to bring the county executives up to speed on all of the regulations that govern our county government.
So during Greg's time period, politics, which has now been was part of Greg's life, he was asked to run for lieutenant governor. So talk about some of the dynamics that happened there where he was torn whether or not he would get involved in a statewide race and how that would impact him, you and others. Talk about that.
Well, that can be certainly an issue for any elected official, but it's probably more difficult when you're the CEO of the government. So he had a lot on his plate, but the thing that came along well before then, and certainly in his time, was that cell phone and that laptop and just far superior communication. So he could go on the road to make his campaign stops, and New York's a very large state, and he might have to travel 4 or 5 hours or 7 or 8 hours to get to Plattsburgh or places like that. Well, he used that drive time to perform his county executive duties and stay plugged in. So I'm sure it was absolutely exhausting to do that, but he was able to pull that off.
And what he also was able to pull off is he won the lieutenant governor's primary to run with Carl Palladino, which then required some decisions to be made.
Well, that made him even more forced to be absent on occasion, but so I was perhaps being the acting county executive more frequently on occasion during that time period, but that can be made distinguished from when he eventually decided to leave office a little bit early to become the director of the Gebbe Foundation. At that point, in my role as acting county executive, I was it. I was the person in charge. I wasn't simply, acting in the absence of a county executive.
Did that change much at all when you all of a sudden became a titled, you actually were the guy, the buck stopped with Steve Abdella for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, they were fortunately short periods of time. One of them was, I think, about 6 weeks, and the other about 4 weeks. But lots of things happen, and the buck stops with you. And I see one county executive in the audience here, and yes, it's never ending. It's every day. There's something that's going to hit you. So I was ready to give up those reins.
Was there a surprise at all during that kind of time period where, sure, you're the county attorney, you're just an office away from the county executive, but it's different?
It's different. I mean, during one of those time periods, Lakeshore Hospital announced they were closing. And so that was very difficult, and we had to work with our state officials to quickly try to mount some sort of demonstration of protest to that and answer the press inquiries. So that was very difficult, and was really a surprise to get that phone call. And it was the middle of December, and out you go to the parking lots at THC, and
how do you prep for that? I mean, that's an emergency. I mean, now everybody's scared. They just don't know what's going to happen, and you got to come and calm it. I mean, you got to say something. But what do you say? I mean, how do you say it?
It's just drawing on your experience, and then certainly talking to the powers that know more about these things, your health department director, other health-related people in the community, and then our state elected officials who have a large stake in it as well. So you just pull it together and have to get out there.
So was this between Edwards and Horrigan? Was that the time period when that's all happened?
This was actually between Borello and P.J. Wendell.
I heard of that last one, yeah. So Fitz Horrigan, an Air Force veteran, all of a sudden decides he had already decided to kind of get into the politics game, but all of a sudden, with Greg's departure, he's now asked to run for county executive and wins. Vince Horrigan.
Vince Horrigan, like all of them in many ways, but was such perhaps from the military background, very even-keeled and ready to act in an emergency, and stay in control. And he was a delight to work with. He did grab on to some of those items I mentioned, which was the North County Regional Water, and that required you to be able to navigate both sides of the aisle as far as also town and village and city politics, and try to herd the cats of all of these entities to form a water district. And he successfully pulled that together, building on Greg Edwards' work. He also was the one who successfully finalized the sale of the county home, and that was probably the most difficult, even more difficult than the regional water district, to actually get that done and closed. And it was right up until literally the day or two before closing that things were still popping, and potential minefields and things that might have made that deal either delayed or maybe perhaps even not happen. And we worked through those things. I had several calls with him down in Florida, where he had gone for the holidays, to get that thing done. And it it was something else, is all I'll say, but it got done, and it was best for the county.
That's all you'll say about the county home? That was a traumatic movement. I mean, the decision behind that actually had to happen before the legislature could actually approve it, let alone then on all the negotiations that went on with state authorities, the buyer, and because I observed a lot of that. And so you're not going to give us a little more detail?
It was just difficult. There were just too many moving parts was part of it. And so things just kept popping up. Mm-hmm. Even when you would think that, well, we're within a few weeks of closing, we've addressed everything, they just kept coming up. And some of them were maybe arcane legal things, relating to real estate practice or other things, but it just never stopped. And
you're here in sunny Chautauqua County, making sure it happens, while Vince is having a margarita in Florida. I get the picture.
Perhaps to a degree, but we were on the phone so much, and he even recounts to this day one phone call where he was sitting in a diner and took a call from me, and so it definitely affected his enjoyment of that holiday. So. Of course, these things have to close on December 31st.
Absolutely.
And so that's what you get.
I know. These IDA guys
Yes.
think the same way. So Vince has one term, and he's followed by George.
George was one who, like Vince, came from the county legislature, as did P.J. Wendell later. So all three of them came in with some knowledge, more knowledge of how county government worked, but still the executive's position is a brand new arena. George, very outgoing personality, and loves to dive into the issues, and his was a relatively shorter stint as county executive before he moved on to become state senator, but he was very enjoyable to work with as well. Again, wanted to learn everything he could about an issue and dive into it, but take positions, make decisions, and move the ball forward was his personality. So we had some interesting ones with him too, but I enjoyed working with George.
Just can't say that. We had some interesting things with him, and then move on?
Well, the thing you find is that county government's a large organization, and there's personnel issues that crop up, and it's difficult because you have to follow the law, and you have to, but it's just a challenge because your job is to prevent disruption in the operation of government and make sure the county can do its job and not have these distractions negatively impact. So it's always a tough challenge to navigate those waters.
Perfect segue to the boss you just had about disrupting government, about the fact of COVID-19 all of a sudden coming in. We had Dr. Burke here 2 weeks ago. What was going on in the county attorney's office? Some decisions had to be made which affected employment, affected everything. You're Chautauqua County resident. So how much was the county attorney involved in all that?
Well, fortuitously, I guess you would say, I had decided just before the start of 2020 to pretty much give up my other significant role as counsel to Jamestown Community College. The two, trying to do both jobs at once had just become too demanding. And I thought, well, if I shed the college, the county is always challenging, but having the focus on that one job, has to make it at least a bit easier. So entering 2020, I'm thinking it's going to be a better situation in terms of life balance. But along comes COVID, and in County Executive Wendell's case, he's a brand new county executive, and I guess the rumblings of it started in February for the most part, but then by March 15th, which is sort of a day we will always remember, just all hell broke loose, and things were never the same, as we all know, for quite a long period of time. And we talk about it being 24/7 anyway in these positions. COVID turned it into that times 10. And God bless PJ, and taking that on, with just the perseverance. I think it helped that instinctively he had a background in emergency management services, and it just, we just launched, and it was quite a time period. Especially in the initial phases, our office and I did have a great deal of involvement in what was happening, and ended up being the one county attorney, legal person, who went into the office every day, while many others worked remotely. Mm-hmm. But it was just all encompassing, just dominated all of our emotions and energy for quite a period of time.
And yet, does it strike you? You were the county attorney of one of the largest corporations, period, certainly in the area. What a big business that you are general counsel to. Does this strike you? Does everyone walk up and say, "Wow, it's not just a government thing; it's just a business"?
Yes, and so as I alluded to earlier, it's all aspects. So it's labor and employment, but it's running a highway system. It's running 2 airports. It was running a nursing home. It's running extensive human services. We joke, but part of the enjoyment of the job is we still maintain one set of New York laws in hardback form, not simply the digital format. And I can tell you, and most county attorneys will, that we touch in our job as county attorney every single statute book on that wall. And you'd say, well, how's that possible? But it's because county government's into everything, and we work with industrial development, we work with agriculture, we work with sewer districts and water districts. It's every type of government service possible, but then spilling over into private sector issues.
So here you are, you're retired. As you look back on 30-plus years of public service, is there a Steve Abdella legacy in all of this?
I don't know about a legacy. You just feel privileged to have had the opportunity to do the job, and the people you meet in the job run the gamut. It's fantastic. I mean, you do have the benefit of being a player in the background to a large degree, but I always felt very much appreciated by all of the elected officials and department heads, and you really want to work hard for them. And so if there's any legacy, it's that, being able to serve all the public officials, and in that regard, serve, all of the residents and taxpayers of the county.
Well, on behalf of all the taxpayers of Chautauqua County and all the county executives, all 8 of them that in some form or fashion you touched, we thank you. I mean, your public service is not often, you don't want it to be heralded, you don't want to be front page news, but you have been the continuum, that rock for all of that time period. We in the business know that, and I'm just delighted that you shared this today.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yep, great. Thank you. Steve Abdella.